Good afternoon, and welcome to this EPA Alumni Association Academy presentation. I'm Walter Mugdan, an association board member and co-chair of the Academy program. I spent 48 years with EPA Region 2 prior to my retirement in 2023, and for the last 7 years of my career, I served as Deputy Regional Administrator. Today's program is titled, "It Seemed Like a Good Idea at the Time." This is one of a series of 4 programs that focus on the toxic legacies of the industrial era. The series explores the origins, history, uses, dangers, and responses to some of the most toxic substances we humans have inflicted upon ourselves. Today, I'll focus on 3 all too common pollutants: asbestos, lead, and coal tar, the latter being the legacy of the gaslight era. So cynics sometimes say that the major cause of problems is solutions, and as with other such sayings, there's at least a small kernel of truth in there. One area in which that kernel is revealed concerns the undeniably problematic toxic legacy of many seemingly good ideas carried out over the past 2 centuries of the industrial era, like asbestos. Well over 4,000 years ago, people had already discovered the extraordinary properties of a group of minerals we know as asbestos. Unlike other rocks, these minerals are made of countless tiny fibers. But like other rocks, these minerals, and the fibers of which they're composed, are essentially fireproof. Together, these 2 characteristics explain why asbestos was, for millennia, thought of as an almost miraculous material, and why, during the past century, it came to be used in an astonishing array of industrial, commercial, and consumer products. Alas, this miracle material is a silent killer that has caused debilitating disease and death for hundreds of thousands, or perhaps millions of people worldwide. So asbestos fibers are truly tiny. The fibers you can see with the naked eye are actually composed of many smaller fibers, which are themselves made up of even smaller fibers. These microscopic fibers range from 1/5 to 1/10,000th the width of a human hair. Size matters, and so does shape. The fibers are long, typically 20 times as long as they are wide. Because they're so tiny, the fibers become readily airborne and are easily inhaled into the lungs. And because they're shaped like needles, long and very thin, they become embedded in lung tissue, causing scarring and cellular damage, which is thought to be the physical mechanisms that cause the disease. It seems like a cruel trick of nature that a substance so useful in so many ways should also be so dangerous. Now, the earliest evidence of use comes from Finland, where potters 4,500 years ago mixed asbestos fibers into clay to strengthen earthenware pottery. By the first millennium AD, from Europe to China, cloth woven from asbestos fibers was being used for its fireproof qualities, or sometimes just to facilitate a neat parlor trick, as when the Persian king Khosrow II would clean his table napkin by throwing it into the fire. Extensive utilization of the miracle fibers began in the second half of the 19th century with successful manufacture of asbestos yarn in Germany and Scotland. And soon, dozens of other uses were invented. Fire retardant coatings for structural components, pipes and pipe insulation, furnace and fireplace brick and cement, electric wire insulation, flooring, roofing, exterior siding, plaster, drywall, joint compound, clothing irons, even children's crayons. By the middle of the 20th century, asbestos products were ubiquitous, widely used in both commercial and residential construction, as well as consumer products. But the role of asbestos in causing disease had been identified as early as 1898. In 1900, in Charing Cross Hospital in London, and the autopsy of a young man who had died of pulmonary fibrosis after working for 14 years in an asbestos textile factory found asbestos fibers in his lungs. A couple of years later, 1902, Britain's inspector of factories, a woman named Adelaide Anderson, listed asbestos as a harmful industrial substance. And in 1924, the death of Nellie Kershaw, who had worked for 7 years in a factory spinning asbestos into yarn, led to the first diagnosis of asbestosis, which is one of the 2 signature diseases associated with the mineral, the other being mesothelioma, a very virulent form of cancer that affects the lining of the lungs. Its association with asbestos was confirmed in the 1940s. The shipbuilding industry used asbestos extensively for fireproofing and insulation in boilers and on steam fittings, and the workers who applied the stuff were particularly vulnerable working in enclosed spaces. In the US alone, an estimated 100,000 people have died or are terminally ill from asbestos-related diseases. It's estimated that some 10,000 people die each year in the US from asbestos-related diseases. And those asbestos workers who smoked are at significantly higher risk than those who didn't. It also became apparent over the decades that asbestos is most dangerous when it's in its friable form, which means easily crumbled or pulverized. If so, it's much more easily to be inhaled. The fibers get into the air and they can be more easily inhaled. Despite the relatively early understanding of the terrible health effects of asbestos exposure, use of the material in all these myriad applications continued to increase. And in the US, it actually reached its peak in 1973, where consumption exceeded 800,000 tons a year. Worldwide peak was a little bit later. It was in 77, with 4.8 million tons produced. Since then, asbestos use has fallen significantly, and that is attributable to the creation of the United States EPA in 1971. Among our first earliest actions was a ban on spray-applied asbestos-containing material for fireproofing and insulating purposes. That was in 73. It was followed in 75 by a ban on many forms of asbestos pipe insulation. In 78 by a ban on additional types of spray-applied surfacing materials. Also in 73, EPA regulated renovation and demolition activities that involved removal of asbestos-containing materials. And a few years later, in 77, the US Consumer Product Safety Commission banned asbestos use in artificial fireplace embers and wall patching compounds. In 89, EPA finally banned asbestos in nearly all uses and products, but that rule was immediately challenged by the industry and overturned by a US appellate court. As a consequence, a large number of uses remain legal in the US. Things like cement shingles, disc brake pads, and clutch facings, and some specialized fireproof garments. Although the US originally led the way in reducing or banning asbestos products and uses, bans are now broader elsewhere in the developed world. The EU, Australia, Hong Kong, Japan, and New Zealand, but other places are less protective: India, China, Russia, and Brazil, where there's still extensive continued use. On March 28th of 2024, EPA finalized a rule to prohibit the manufacture, including import, and processing of most uses of chrysotile asbestos, which is one of the most common, but also one of the most dangerous, and it was the last type of asbestos used in the US. In June of 2025, EPA Administrator Zeldin announced that EPA will reconsider the ban to determine whether it went beyond what is necessary. But, surprise, maybe to some, in December of 2025, Administrator Zeldin decided to stand behind the 2024 rule, although he said EPA would provide some further guidance on how it should be administered. We haven't seen that as yet. So, lawsuits. The first lawsuit against asbestos manufacturers were brought in 1929, long time, almost a century ago. But the number of claims skyrocketed after 1982, when a retired Boilermaker won a record award of $2.3 million in compensatory damages and $1.5 million in punitive damages. And in the following decades, nearly 1 million people have filed claims. In response, many of the defendants, like W.R. Grace, declared bankruptcy, starting in 1982 with the Johns Manville Corporation, a Fortune 500 company, and that was at the time the largest company ever to file for bankruptcy. But in due course, more than half the major asbestos manufacturers have sought bankruptcy protection. The total costs of asbestos litigation in the US are estimated to eventually reach 250 to 275 billion with a B. By the way, litigation has also occurred in other countries, including Ireland, Scotland, and England, but the awards have not been nearly as large as here in the US. Construction of the first two of the twin towers of the ill-fated World Trade Center in New York City was underway when EPA's 1973 ban on spray-on asbestos coating went into effect. The first 40 floors of the North Tower had already been built with asbestos coatings. Uh, among the many terrible consequences of the attacks on 9/11, an estimated 1,000 tons of asbestos was in that huge dust cloud that billowed through lower Manhattan and was in the pile of debris left where the towers had stood. EPA, we had our on-scene coordinators at the World Trade Center site on the afternoon of 9/11 to start monitoring for asbestos and other dangerous materials. And we spent years, literally years, mounting an intensive cleanup, initially just outside and then eventually inside in buildings all throughout the entire lower Manhattan area. Now, as people probably know, many firefighters and other emergency responders have suffered serious health effects, although those are believed to be primarily associated with exposure while people worked directly on the pile, because they were exposed not only to the asbestos, but also to a mixture of all sorts of dangerous fumes from the fires that burned for weeks deep inside the pile. To date, there's no conclusive evidence that people who lived or worked a little further away, but still near the Trade Center site, were also harmed by asbestos or other substances. But it's sobering to reflect that the time between harmful exposure and the appearance of disease is typically 10 to 20 years and can be as long as 40 years. So what's the bottom line? Oh, Superfund, and I'll mention that a lot of asbestos sites where asbestos was mined or manufactured, a number of those have become Superfund sites. Libby, Montana is kind of the poster child. W.R. Grace operated a vermiculite mine there. Sometimes that's a sometimes naturally contaminated by small amounts of asbestos. And in the case of Libby, almost all the vermiculite was contaminated with asbestos. And the byproducts were used all over the town in buildings and backfill and landscaping. About 10% of the population died from asbestos-related diseases. The U.S. criminally prosecuted Grace and seven officials for knowingly endangering the residents, but they were all acquitted, so that didn't go. I mentioned later that the company declared bankruptcy. EPA spent $425 million or more on cleanup of the town, including homes and yards and public areas. Bottom line, asbestos is unsafe in any amount. Here's what OSHA has to say about it. It is a mineral that has almost miraculous properties, but it is very deadly. There is no safe level of exposure. So I'll end this section on asbestos with a little anecdote about the strange case of Howard Stecker. So I was, as Lori said, I worked for EPA for 48 years. During that entire time, I am happy to say that I only on 2 occasions ever became aware of an EPA person being offered a bribe. And in at least one of those cases, I know that they declined it. Now, maybe there's other instances that I'm not aware of. And by definition, it's a criminal activity. So by definition, it isn't easily knowable. But the strange case of Howard Stecker was unusual. So Howard Stecker was EPA Region 2's asbestos inspector in the 70s and 80s. And he was enormously good at it. He was productive. He generated lots and lots of cases. They were good cases, and we got a lot of action. But then there came a time where he suddenly started to slack off. And he was still doing inspections, but we weren't getting the inspection reports or the case referrals. And then eventually, he disappeared entirely. He just didn't come. He was no longer in the office. Well, what we learned is that he had been offered bribes. He started to take them. These are from the asbestos demolition and renovation operations, which almost all were very sleazy operations. He then turned from accepting bribes to soliciting them. And coincidentally, on one time when he solicited a bribe from an asbestos company president who was in the operation, there happened to be present at the same time an undercover agent of the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Agency, ATF, who had been placed as a purported employee of the asbestos company in order to keep track of what the president of the asbestos company was doing, because the ATF thought he was running guns to Ireland, to the IRA in Ireland. Well, that ATF agent heard Howard Stecker shake down the asbestos company. The agent went back to the U.S. Attorney office that was running his operation and said, "Hey, EPA's got a dirty inspector." So they called him in. They called Howard Stecker in. They flipped him. He then went back out to do inspections. But this time he didn't solicit bribes. He simply waited for them to come to him, to be offered to him. And a total of 17 criminal cases against asbestos companies for seeking to bribe a US government official were brought and successfully concluded. Stecker himself, as far as we know, went into the witness inspection program and has never been heard from since. So that was an interesting little turn of events in the asbestos world. Moving on to lead. So lead is a pretty, I think, an extraordinary metal. We talk about plumbing the depths of a very heavy metal. It's a remarkable thing. It's very, very useful. It's easily extracted from its ores. It's been used by people since prehistoric times. Unlike other metals, it isn't shiny. It's kind of dull and lusterless, but it nevertheless has a distinctly bright side that has been put into wide use throughout history, but it also has a very dark side, which is it's highly toxic in almost all of its forms. So let's start with the name, plumbum. The Latin name for lead was plumbum. It gives us its chemical symbol Pb. It's very heavy. Atomic number 82, just a little bit lighter than uranium, which at 92 is the heaviest naturally occurring element. And of course, all the words plumbing, plumber, plumb, and a plumb, so forth, come from that derivation. We talk about carpenters use a plumb bob to determine whether something is straight. And there's a lot of other use of it. We plumb the depths of a matter when we are deeply focused. We act with a plumb when we are uprightly self-confident. So lead pellets, or lead pellets made into beads, date back to at least 8,500 years ago. They've been found. And the earliest evidence of metal smelting activities dates all the way back to that time. So 8,500 years. It was the first metal, as far as we know, that people learned how to smelt. Everything else came later. Iron and copper and bronze and brass and all of that came later. The ancient Egyptians used lead in cosmetics. Again, it seemed like a good idea at the time. It was again in use in Elizabethan England when pale white faces were desired, because lead makes a wonderful white color, as we'll talk about later. There is down in the lower left, you see an iconic painting of Queen Elizabeth I. Always had this very, very pale look. That wasn't because she was naturally pale. It was because she used lead-based cosmetics. The ancient Greeks, by the way, used lead pellets for shot in slings, sort of the progenitors of bullets that we now use. Medieval alchemists spent centuries trying to transform lead into silver and gold. Of course, they failed, but they did learn a lot about real chemistry along the way. And of course, lead has been used for years for writing. Think of lead pencils. Because of its durability, it has been used to line coffins in cultures that seek to preserve the body of the deceased. And because of its easy workability, it was used to assemble small pieces of glass into larger windows.
Yet, hold on a second. I got to stop this.
Folks, could you please go put yourself on mute? It was used to assemble small pieces of glass to assemble larger windows, and of course, most notably, the colored glass that created the magnificent stained glass installations in cathedrals. For centuries, it has also been used to make bullets and related armaments. And today, because of its density, lead is used as shielding from exposure to harmful radiation, for example, the X-rays. That's why the apron the dentist puts on you before taking an image is so heavy. So various lead compounds have distinctive colors and have been used since ancient times to make paint. Lead chromate makes a bright yellow pigment. Lead oxide or red lead makes a vibrant red-orange color. And most common, lead carbonate, which is a compound of lead, carbon, and oxygen, makes white lead, used since at least the 4th century BCE for its own pure white color and as a base for making many, many other colors. The lead in paint also accelerates drying time. It improves the durability and it resists corrosion. The Romans, by the way, master hydraulic engineers, used lead pipes to bring water from their famous aqueducts into homes, public baths, and public fountains. And indeed, it wasn't until the Industrial Revolution that worldwide production of lead reached levels comparable to the time of Augustus Caesar. As indoor plumbing became a hallmark of modern industrial society, lead pipes were, once again, widely used, primarily for the service lines that bring water from the well in the backyard or from the water main in the street into the home itself. And in the US alone, EPA estimates 4 million homes have lead service lines. And in many more millions of homes, copper pipes are joined together with lead solder. In addition, and by the way, we'll talk a little bit more about drinking water pipes in a moment. But in addition to paint and plumbing, modern society has used vast amounts of lead in two other ways, both associated with the internal combustion engine. First, it's a key component in lead acid batteries, found in nearly every motor vehicle for over a century. And second, starting in the 1920s, a compound called tetraethyl lead was used as a gasoline additive to raise octane levels, eliminate engine knock, and reduce wear on valve seats, although it increased fouling of spark plugs. So those are all the myriad very, very useful purposes for lead. It's, however, highly toxic in nearly all of its forms. And we've known that for a long, long time. It adversely affects a wide range of organs and bodily functions, particularly the nervous system. Among its most insidious effects, it inhibits or disturbs the proper development of a child's brain, reducing the child's intellectual capacity, so in common parlance, IQ, and contributes to serious behavioral problems. The dangers of lead exposure have been recognized for a very long time. In the 1st century BCE, the famous Roman engineer and architect Vitruvius urged that lead not be used for water pipes. His advice was ignored then and continued to be ignored in much more recent times. Today, public health authorities have determined no amount of exposure to lead is safe. So what are the pathways of exposure? Well, ingestion from lead leaching out of drinking water plumbing, or by ingesting the dust from lead paint and lead contaminated soil. And number two, inhalation of air polluted either by the burning of leaded gasoline in motor vehicles or inhaling lead paint dust. In localized situations, let's talk about exposure in the air. All right. So emissions from burning leaded gasoline, we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, and lead smelters. So lead has to be smelted, and these are primary lead smelters, make lead from ore, and secondary lead smelters make lead from other formerly used lead products. And the air pollution from these lead smelters was usually localized close to where the smelter was built. Often they were built in densely populated areas, urban areas. And so those sites, the ones near where these smelters were located formerly, have often turned into Superfund sites. There's a little photograph there or a map showing the Omaha lead Superfund site, one of the largest urban Superfund sites in the country. Other sources of lead exposure, as I said, 64 million American homes have lead paint somewhere in the building, and 12 million of those homes have kids under 7 living there. And those old paint chips and the chips turn to dust. Lead paint was also used widely on bridges and similar structures. And when those would be maintained, the paint would either be scraped off or sandblasted off. And of course, the lead dust would then get into the surrounding communities. By the way, Region 2, many years ago, created a best management practices document for how to do this kind of lead paint removal on bridges and similar structures in a safe way by enclosing them, doing the work in an enclosed kind of a tent kind of like enclosure. Other sources of exposure still persist, particularly in the third world. Impoverished people, often children, eke out meager livings by recycling electronics from first world countries. They reclaim the lead and other metals by melting them on cooking stoves or over small fires, and of course they inhale the dangerous vapors. Even some commercial scale automobile battery recycling operations in third world countries, which are used and funded by US companies, have polluted the communities where they operate. And of course, it's not just humans that are at risk. Lead is still the most common metal used in bullets, shot, and other ammo, and for fishing sinkers. So even when the animals aren't killed outright by hunting or fishing, many forms of wildlife do suffer from lead exposure to spent shot and lost sinkers. So now let's talk a little bit about getting the lead out. So our story starts in the 1940s. So there was a geochemist named Claire Patterson who started work to determine the age of the Earth. And how he thought he was going to do it was by measuring lead isotopes in meteor and soil fragments. But as he gathered these samples from all over the world, he was surprised to find lead everywhere. And eventually he realized it came from the burning of leaded gasoline, and he raised the alarm. However, the petroleum, the lead industries ridiculed and vilified him. They claimed, oh, ubiquitous lead is natural and it's harmless. Sound familiar? Sound familiar from the tobacco industry or PCBs or PFAS? But he then set about proving it. He drilled ice cores to prove there had been no atmospheric lead prior to the 1920s when leaded gasoline was introduced. None, zero. He published, he testified in Congress, and his data years later was central to EPA's effort to ban leaded gasoline. And by the way, he built himself, he created for himself an ultra clean laboratory to test his meteorite samples. And he did prove that the Earth was 4.53 billion years old, 1.2 billion years older than had previously been thought. So he cleaned his lab, and then he set about to clean up the world. So arguably, the single greatest public health improvement action taken by the US was to ban lead in gasoline. So EPA required unleaded gasoline to first be sold starting in 1975. By the way, during the entire period of time from the 1920s, there was one gasoline company that always sold unleaded gasoline, and they patted themselves on the back and advertised it, and that was Amoco. Just saying. But in 1975, increasingly stringent air pollution control requirements for automobiles required that almost all manufacturers, to meet those standards, had to start using catalytic converters. And since then, all cars have basically had catalytic converters. Trouble was, catalytic converters would be destroyed by using leaded gasoline. So in 1975, EPA said all gas stations bigger than a certain minimal size have to sell unleaded gasoline. And then the EPA regulations actually did require a phased out reduction in the amount of lead in leaded gasoline, starting in 1973. So by 86, there should be a 91% reduction in the amount of lead in leaded gasoline. In 1996, the 1992, the Clean Air Act banned leaded gasoline for use in on-road vehicles, effective in 1996. The effect of all of this was that between 1970 and 2011, estimated nationwide lead emissions decreased by 99.6%, or 220,000 tons, almost all of it due to the elimination of lead from gasoline. There are many countries around the world have followed suit, but there are some countries like these listed here: Algeria, Iraq, Yemen, Myanmar, North Korea, Afghanistan, where leaded gasoline continues to be utilized. So in 1978, EPA banned consumer and residential use of lead-based paint. Of course, that's the other major source of lead exposure in North America. Many other countries eventually did the same, although it's still used in some 45 countries around the world. There's even a few industrial uses that are allowed in the US. In 2008, EPA promulgated its first lead-based paint rules, which say anybody who's doing renovation, repair, and painting work that disturbs lead-based paint, childcare facilities, homes, preschools built before 78, those contractors have to be certified by EPA or an authorized state, and they have to use certified renovators that are trained by EPA-approved instructors. And anybody who sells or rents a pre-78 home has to provide pamphlets to buyers or renters informing them of the dangers of exposure to lead. But lead water pipes are still with us. These are called lead service lines. They remain in wide use. When exposed to water that is acidic or alkaline, and so of course that would be a pH level either lower or greater than 7, which is neutral, corrosion will occur and lead will leach from the pipes into the water. So even though lead service pipes are very durable, they will leach if they're exposed to acidic or alkaline water. Actually, some historians have suggested that exposure to lead from water pipes contributed to the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. However, most scholars now disagree with that. By the way, chloride in salt, that can also cause corrosion. So what did EPA do about that? Now, in 1991, EPA promulgated the initial lead and copper rule, or LCR, pursuant to the Safe Drinking Water Act. And that required public water supply systems to monitor levels of these contaminants in customers' drinking water at the tap. So they don't monitor back at the drinking water reservoir or at the drinking water distribution system. They got to monitor it at the tap, which is where people drink. And if more than a specified percentage of the monitored residences exceed the federal action level, which is 15 parts per billion for lead, then additional obligatory actions are triggered. And they can include instituting or optimizing, if they've already got some, corrosion control treatment, for example, with orthophosphate or other chemicals, which coat the inside of the pipes and thereby minimize or prevent lead and copper from leaching into the drinking water, but which are otherwise not harmful to people drinking the water. And under certain circumstances, carrying out a lead service line replacement program in their service area. In October of 2024, by the way, the lead and copper rule has been updated a number of times over the decades since 1991, but most recently in October 2024, EPA finalized a series of strengthening revisions to the LCR. And as far as I'm aware, that remains in effect and has not been the subject of one of the rollback actions that Administrator Zeldin has commenced. EPA has also issued solid cleanup guidelines. I'm not going to go into this in much detail, but there are all these lead sites. And the question is, at what point do you trigger a cleanup, either a Superfund removal action or a Superfund remedial action? These are different species of Superfund cleanups, and they have different action levels or triggering action levels. Again, in January of 2024, EPA issued updated guidance, which made those action levels a little bit more stringent. In October of 2025, EPA issued superseding guidance that rolled them back a little bit. The guidance is still in effect and still reasonably strong, but it's a bit of a rollback from the 2024, January 2024 EPA guidance. I will note at the bottom on the screen here, the Project 2025 document, which everybody understands to be sort of the blueprint for the current Trump administration, does include the following aim or objective. Quote, develop and execute a 10-year cleanup plan to address lead at all existing cleanup sites. That includes benchmarks and milestones that allow for congressional and public oversight of the schedule. So that's a very ambitious and I think appropriate target. The devil's in the details. It depends a little bit on how effective the cleanups are, but that has probably been specified now by the October 2025 guidance, and that'll presumably be driving EPA in this direction to try and get the cleanups moving and finish them off. So, as a conclusion, humankind has been ingenious in putting lead to work in many useful ways, but as has often been the case, our ingenuity has proven to be the source of grave damage to ourselves and other living creatures. Plumbum, among the heaviest of metals, has left us with one of the heaviest of burdens. But recognizing the weight of that burden need not be a cause for despair. On the contrary, as EPA pointed out in the pre-publication notice of the proposed revisions to the lead and copper rule back in 2024, as a result of multiple federal laws and regulations, the median concentration of lead in the blood of children aged 1 to 5 years dropped from 15 milligrams per deciliter in the period from 1976 to 1980 to 0.7 micrograms per deciliter in 2013 to 2014. That's a decrease of 95% in children's blood lead levels. And that's a decade ago. I don't know the current data, I probably should, but it's clear that we have more to do, to be sure, but we have made tremendous progress. And actually, here's a little note about the University of Utah scientists who compared hair samples from people who lived 100 years ago to those today. And they can identify exactly in the hair samples of people at these different times when lead started to be used, when it became ubiquitous, and how it has dropped as a result of all these regulatory actions. Finally, a tale of two cities. So people are very well familiar with Flint, Michigan. 2014, Flint changed its drinking water source from the Detroit River to the Flint River. And the Flint River water has a high chloride content, salt, but Flint declined to treat to reduce its corrosivity. And much of Flint's old housing stock has lead service lines, as are ubiquitous elsewhere around the country. For several years, unsuspecting residents were exposed to dangerously high levels of lead in their drinking water. And then city and state and EPA officials delayed notification to the residents. This was quite a dramatic problem at EPA. Region 5 regional administrator essentially more or less lost her job. I think did lose her job as a result of this failure. 15 state and local officials were indicted. 7 pled guilty. Later on in June of 2019, all charges were dropped for reasons that aren't entirely clear. But nevertheless, this was a very, very serious problem. Gina McCarthy, who was administrator of EPA at the time, issued at that time a memorandum to all EPA personnel saying, if you become aware of a situation that you think causes imminent danger, some immediate environmental harm, and you've brought it to the attention of your supervisor and you're not satisfied that things are being done, you not only have an opportunity, but an obligation to elevate it. And here is the way you would do that. To my knowledge, that policy is still in effect. Anyhow, that was Flint, Michigan. By contrast, Newark, New Jersey is the city that did not become Flint. In late 2018, there was a similar problem that was identified in Newark. They again had changed the water that they were using from one reservoir to a different one for part of their area and their network. It had either was more acidic or more alkaline. And they discovered that people at the tap were being exposed to elevated levels of lead. And they immediately took action. They provided within days, literally over the course of a weekend, from I think a Thursday or a Friday to the following Monday, they started providing free bottled water to all of the residents. And within a couple of weeks thereafter, they were providing free point-of-use filters to some 40,000 effective residents. So these are made by a company called Pure, P-U-R, and they sort of screw onto your water faucet in your kitchen, and that's a point-of-use filter. But after all of that great work, in summer of 2019, just a few months later, sampling suggested that these filters might not achieve the anticipated lead reduction that they were advertised to achieve. So together with EPA and the New Jersey agency, Newark carried out an intensive study of filter performance. Some of this work was done in our own Office of Research and Development, the late lamented Office of Research and Development at EPA. In November of 2019, the study was published. It showed that the filters could not reliably achieve the anticipated results when water entering the filter exceeded 150 parts per billion. Now that's 10 times the drinking water action level. However, the study also found that if people flushed the water for 5 minutes after an extended period of non-use, like overnight, that would be effective in reducing the influent lead concentrations, and then the filter would be fully effective. So that information was broadly turned around to all the local people. More importantly, let me just quickly go back. Newark initiated an incredible lead service line replacement program. They had been on a trajectory to replace about the 18,000 lead service lines in their city over a 10-year period. With financial assistance from the county and the state and the federal state revolving fund, they accelerated that, and they got rid of all the lead service lines throughout Newark in under 3 years. And the two brilliant things that they did was, number one, they said the city of Newark will pay for the entire lead service line replacement. Normally, cities pay for that portion of the lead service line that they own, which is from the service main in the street to the property line, and the property owner is asked to pay or invited to pay for the portion of the service line that goes from the property line to the house. And so many people simply decline to do it because they can't afford it or they don't want to pay. Newark said, we'll pay for all of it. But then Newark went further and they issued an ordinance that says, and the homeowner cannot say no. The homeowner is obliged to say yes when we come knocking on the door and say we're going to do this. And that's to protect children in the home, to protect future owners, and so forth. And so that has made this one of the most successful and impressive lead service line replacement programs in the nation. So that's a tale of two very, very different cities, two very, very different ways of approaching a serious public health problem. That brings us to the next and final part of our program, the environmental legacy of the gaslight era. So for thousands and thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, maybe hundreds of thousands of years, human beings couldn't do much better than candlelight or firelight for illumination. Eventually, vegetable oils, animal oils, beeswax, all of these were used, and some of them did burn brighter than others. Whale oil, for example, was a very, very prominent use in the up till the 18th or 19th century. All of these were used, but the candle power, which is literally the name of how much light something creates, a source of light emits, the candle power was not dramatically different among all of these different sources of light until 1792, when William Murdoch, who was an employee of James Watt of steam engine fame, he illuminated his house with methane gas that was distilled from coal. So coal gas, we'll talk about it in a second, how it's made. Coal gas is chemically similar to the natural gas that is widely in use today. So the natural gas today comes from gas wells in the Gulf of Mexico and elsewhere. It's piped to throughout the country and throughout the world. It's chemically very similar to the gas that comes from coal. And gaslight was enormously brighter, significantly brighter and steadier and cleaner than candles or oil lamps or all the other kinds of things that had been previously used. In 1814, gas streetlights began to be installed in London, and within a couple of years, this had crossed the pond and gaslights were coming into the US. There were, I think, 300 miles of gas pipe had already been laid in London by 1819. So within just 5 years, there were 300 miles of gas pipe and 51,000 burners, many of them in homes and some of them outdoors. So this was an immediate success, and the reason was because it was just such a better way of lighting. But coal gas turned out to be very, very messy to produce. Once again, seemed like a good idea at the time, but it had a real toxic legacy. So the way that coal gas is produced is coal is heated up in the absence of oxygen, so it doesn't burn, but it dissociates and it drives off the gas, the methane gas that gets collected in these big gas tanks that you see here in these images. You may have seen them elsewhere in the world. They're still used, this kind of a container is still used to store natural gas for distribution. But it also leaves behind a horrible residue called coal tar, which is gooey and loaded with toxic compounds like polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs, that are known or suspected carcinogens. Now, again, coal tar had some uses and actually still continues to have a few uses, although it isn't much made anymore. It was actually the origins of what we now call the petrochemical industry, which makes virtually everything, plastics and all sorts of other things. The origins of that industry were doing similar things with coal tar, because coal tar is similar to petroleum in it's essentially a fossil fuel. Coal tar was able to be the progenitor of the earliest types of plastics and certain, believe it or not, medications and things of that sort. So it had value, but not enough value to use all of it up. And so most of it was simply dumped on the ground. And when it was dumped on the ground, because it never really hardens, the coal tar, and because it was commonly dumped on the ground, it would ooze downward into the soil until it reached some kind of an obstruction, like bedrock or a clay, or a layer of clay. And then it would move sideways along that obstruction. And because these manufactured gas plants, or MGPs, were so often built next to the water, because the coal was brought in by barge, the coal tar would inevitably get into the water. And everything in the path of the tar became contaminated. For the past 40 or 45 years, we have worked at cleaning coal tar sites, always at great cost. Many of them have become federal or state Superfund sites. One of the most notorious in my old former region was the Gowanus Canal, which had not one, not two, but three manufactured gas plants along its very short 2-mile long stretch. The Gowanus Canal is arguably the most heavily contaminated waterway in the US. Normally in the Superfund world, we measure contamination parts per million or parts per billion, for example, for PCBs. Parts per trillion is how we measure dioxin. Parts per quadrillion is how EPA a few years ago issued a health advisory for PFAS, for a couple of PFAS compounds. In the Gowanus Canal, at the bottom of the 10-foot layer of contaminated sediment, we can measure PAHs at parts per 100. So that's how heavily contaminated that piece of waterway is. But it's a Superfund site, and fancy that, it's being cleaned up. And another thing. So there's another place in which which lighting, the intention to create a better light has caused a real toxic legacy. By the way, so in 1885, let me start this way. In 1885, there was a German chemist whose name was Karl Auer von Welsbach, and he invented something called the modern gas mantle. So prior to that time, gas light in homes and in street lamps was simply an open flame. It might have had a reflector around it so that the light was reflected out into the room or out into the street more effectively. But it was really just an open flame coming out of a spigot where the gas was lit. And in 1885, Welsbach discovered that you can make something called a gas mantle. And it enables the gas light to burn much more brightly and much more steadily, and therefore it creates more light and less heat than if you just burn the gas as it emerges from the pipe. So here's a picture down the lower left of what a gas mantle is. It's typically made out of cotton or silk. Looks like a little balloon or a little bag or a little purse. It's attached to the spout from which the gas emerges. And what it does is it creates a broad surface. All these little woven areas create a huge amount of surface area on which the burning actually takes place. And therefore, the burning is just much brighter. And the mantle itself glows very, very brightly. Now, it turns to ash almost as soon as it's lit. But astonishingly, the little mantle retains its shape and continues to function as long as it isn't jostled. If you bang it, it'll all fall apart because it's just ash. But as long as you don't bang it or jostle it, it'll continue to work light after light after light. Now, obviously, we don't use gas lighting in homes or streets anymore, but you may still be familiar with gas mantles if you've ever gone camping with like a Coleman camp lantern or something like that. So they're still used today. But Welsbach discovered that he was using various metals and rare earth compounds to strengthen and brighten the mantle. And in 1890, he started using thorium, which gives off an even much brighter and whiter light. However, thorium, which is named after Thor, the Norse god of thunder, is radioactive, and it produces radioactive radon gas when it decays. When heated, radioactive radium is volatilized, and it's released each time that the mantle is lit. And of course, people living in the area or working in the area are then exposed to that radioactive gas. Obviously, not a good idea. It was being used as late as the 1940s. But nowadays, it's not used anymore. The mantles today are impregnated with alternatives like yttrium or zirconium. They're less efficient than thorium, but they're much, much safer, of course. Now, Welsbach, in 1890, he established a factory in Camden, New Jersey, to make his newly invented gas mantles. And it became an enormous facility. That upper picture there is a picture of the facility when it was in its full swing. That's because everybody in the world who had access to gas was lighting homes with gas. Now, you'll take a look at the date, 1890. Gas lighting was still very, very, very common, but electric lighting had essentially been proven to be effective in the 1876 time period. And by the 1880s and 1890s, it was beginning to dominate home lighting. Nevertheless, gas mantles in much of the world were still being used, and his factory was in full swing for decades thereafter. Competitor General Gas Mantle Company also opened up another factory nearby. Both of them used the thorium, They extracted the thorium from ores, and that created a huge amount of waste product that still had some radioactivity in it. And those wastes were given away for free, and they were used as fill material for housing developments and surrounding communities. Anybody who attended the lecture I gave, or a webinar I gave back, I think last September, on the radium girls and the US Radium Company, will see that there's a theme here. These companies that extracted radioactive materials from ores always had a lot left over of radioactive waste, and they always gave it away to be used as fill in the local communities, and they always made a mess. In 1990, a century later, tests showed elevated levels of gamma radiation, which is among the most dangerous, from soil under and around many of the homes near the factory site, and from public places, parks, and in the factory site itself, of course, and adjacent roadbeds. So again, in many cases, these factories were they generated local residential communities because those were the workers who worked in the factories. And those development of those residential communities used this fill and then ended up being contaminated with radioactivity. So the Wellsback Superfund site was, of course.
Yes. Quick question. Where are the choppers?
Could you please put yourself on mute, folks? Thank you. Whoever's asking about the chompers may want to put themselves on mute. It became a Superfund site in 1996, and EPA has to date spent already about $300 million to remove over 380,000 tons of radioactive contaminated soil from over 120 residences, ballparks, park areas, commercial areas. We still have a lot of work to be done. It's going to end up costing between $800 million and $1 billion that will be needed to clean up the factory building itself and the other contaminated areas. So a huge legacy. Now, under the Superfund program, those of you who are familiar with it know that the companies or entities responsible for the contamination can be or are liable to pay for the cleanup. However, the Wellsback company is long since gone. It just doesn't exist anymore. So now we get to some interesting historical events. So both the Wellsback and the General Gas Mantle companies, they both went out of business decades ago. So initially, EPA assumed that there were no Superfund responsible parties who could foot the bill for this extremely expensive cleanup. Until 2010, that is. And that year, an attorney with EPA Region 2 named Elizabeth LeBlanc, she discovered a historical connection between the General Gas Mantle Company, not Wellsback, but the competitor, General Gas Mantle, and the Kerr-McGee Company, which was a huge multinational chemical company headquartered in Oklahoma. So ordinarily, that kind of a discovery would be very welcome news because government funds for cleanup of hazardous waste sites of this magnitude are severely limited. But a few years earlier, Kerr-McGee had transferred many of its environmental liabilities, including those associated with the General Gas Mantle and the Wellsback site, to a subsidiary corporation that it named Tronox. And then in 2006, Kerr-McGee had spun off the Tronox subsidiary to become a completely independent corporation. EPA's claim regarding the Wellsback and General Gas Mantle site, along with claims involving many other sites against Kerr-McGee, would have therefore been against Tronox and not against Kerr-McGee, because Kerr-McGee had moved those liabilities to Tronox and then spun off Tronox. Well, no sooner had it spun off Tronox than Kerr-McGee sold itself for $19 billion to Anadarko, a large and prosperous energy company. Well, meanwhile, things didn't go so well for the newly minted Tronox Corporation. It was saddled with these huge environmental liabilities that far outweighed the comparatively meager value of the assets with which it had been endowed by its former parent company. And in 2009, just 3 years after it had been created, Tronox declared bankruptcy. So it looks like EPA would get nothing more than a few cents on the dollar for its environmental claims. But Tronox did not go quietly into bankruptcy. Instead, it filed a multi-billion-dollar fraudulent conveyance lawsuit against its former parent, Kerr-McGee, and KM's new parent, Anadarko. The lawsuit contended that KM had intentionally, but secretly, loaded Tronox up with environmental liabilities that far exceeded the value of the assets, thus committing a fraud against the company's shareholders, creditors, and environmental claimants. EPA, along with other claimants, joined the Tronox lawsuit as co-plaintiffs after a lengthy and complex trial in which the plaintiffs prevailed. The parties reached a settlement. And by the way, I'll just mention that there was only one fact witness in this 5-week trial. A lot of business witnesses, but only one fact witness, and that was a manager from Region 2 named Rich Pavogel, and he was fantastic. Well, under the terms of the settlement that was reached in April of 2014, Anadarko and its subsidiary, Kerr-McGee, agreed to hand over a whopping $5.15 billion, one of the largest environmental payouts ever. And of this amount, about $224 million was designated for the Wellsback General Gas Mantle contamination site in New Jersey to help pay for the long ongoing cleanup. So Gaslight is long gone, but it still casts dangerous and expensive shadows across our modern landscape. So with that, I think we've just hit 5 p.m. But if folks want to stick around a little longer, I'll be happy to answer any questions that folks may have had. Lori, have we got any questions out there?
Yes. So the first one came in at the very beginning of the program. It says, given the history of corporations and toxics, how do you foresee the companies and government dealing with the effects of the forever chemicals and plastics?
So those are the forever chemicals, are the PFAS compounds, PFAS, polyfluorinated alkaline substances, or something very close to that, of which there are about 10,000. I think that's the latest estimate of the number of those compounds. Only a few of them are or were in ubiquitous use for both industrial and commercial purposes, starting with Teflon and firefighting foam and Gore-Tex fabrics and stain-resistant sofas and chairs and furniture and things like that. They're all over. Some of the worst or the most common, like PFOA and PFOS, the manufacturers have voluntarily stopped making them. But for example, DuPont, which made PFOA and Teflon, replaced it with something called a group of chemicals called Gen X. Gen X chemicals are about 10 times less toxic than the chemicals they were replacing, but they're still toxic, and the stuff is still everywhere. So now immediately there have been lawsuits, and there were a major lawsuit in West Virginia against DuPont resulted in a very, very significant outcome, a payout to people who were affected. Those kind of things do catch the attention of corporations. Whether the corporations that make PFAS will be any smarter than all of the companies that manufactured asbestos and went bankrupt, or all the other companies that have done all the other dumb things that this and similar programs that I have ready to go in future years. Whether the corporations will be any brighter this time around than last, I kind of doubt it. But it's time to regulate. That's a whole nother program that maybe we'll do again someday. I think we've had a program on PFAS in the past, but it's probably in the next year or two might be time to do it again. There is clean water regulation, and there are a couple of PFAS compounds that are now Superfund hazardous substances and therefore can be cleaned up using the Superfund program. But again, that's for another program, another day.
Okay, we have a couple of comments that I want to say. I do want to mention that the video and the slides will be available on the EPA alumni website probably within a week, if you're interested in following that. And all the most recent, in particular previous Academy sessions, can also be found on the website. So I got just
while you're mentioning that, I'll
Yes.
do a quick advertisement for our next Academy programs, and then we can come back and see if there's any more questions. But on Thursday, March 19th, we have a program on the green grid, focusing on the critical importance of building better electric transmission infrastructure to manage the increasing production of renewable energy, for example, offshore wind, assuming that the administration is able to be restrained from its efforts to kill offshore wind. While at the same time, the electric industry is grappling with the huge demand from data centers that support AI and cryptocurrency. So the speakers are going to be Mike Jacobs from the Union of Concerned Scientists and Girish Bihal from the New York Power Authority. So that should be a great program on March 19th. And on April 8th, our program is on a success story of oceanic proportions. And that focuses on sustainable solutions that are revolutionizing the fishing industry. And leading that presentation is Amanda Leland, who is the executive director of the Environmental Defense Fund, EDF. And that program will tell the story of unlikely partnerships and sustainable solutions that are quietly revolutionizing the fishing industry. So keep watch for the announcements of those programs coming up. Now I'll go back, and if there's any other questions about the program that's just finished, I'd be happy to take them, either through the chat or otherwise.
Yeah, in the chat there was a comment that white lead was used to paint apple tree trunks to keep apple moth larvae from climbing the trees and getting into the apples. EPA did a cleanup of yards of a residential development in New York State. It was just a comment.
Yet another use of white lead that I was unaware of, but maybe the next time I'll add it. If I ever do this program again, I'll add it in.
I'm
sure it seemed like a good idea at the time.
Yeah. We were encouraged to check out Netflix movie on lead children.
I'll make a note of that too. Although I'm one of the 5 people in America that doesn't have a Netflix account, so I'll have to figure it out anywhere.
Another comment was to check out the United Nations led effort on lead. It's called Partnership for a Lead-Free Future.
Something that I am aware of, but I didn't include it in my program. But thanks again for pointing that one out.
Yeah. Here's another question, sort of. I was shocked, sort of, to read the news that EPA registered a pesticide containing a PFAS compound. Didn't we learn anything from DDT?
You were shocked to learn that.
Shocked, yes. So the rest of it, everyone is just saying what a fantastic presentation this was. A great program. Thank you so much to Walter. And I would add my voice to the chorus. Thank you so much, Walter.
My pleasure. And maybe in future years, we'll have opportunities to do, as I said, I got 4 of these on 4 sets of different pollutants. So we'll see if we bring them back another time. But thanks, everyone.
And I would thank everyone for joining us today. Look forward to seeing you at our next webinar in March. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thanks all.